The courtroom was silent as two officers, freshly uniformed but visibly rattled, shuffled into the room. Their eyes darted nervously around, avoiding the gaze of everyone seated. The murmurs in the audience hushed to silence as the bailiff announced the arrival of the presiding judge. "All rise," he called. The officers stood awkwardly, their hands fidgeting, clearly uncomfortable. The heavy door behind the judge's bench creaked open, and a figure stepped forward, Judge Alexandria Roberts. She was dressed impeccably in her black judicial robe, her expression calm but steely. Her rich, dark skin seemed to radiate authority under the courtroom lights, and her sharp eyes zeroed in on the two officers. They froze, their faces turning ashen. It was her, the black woman they had arrested just days ago, dragging her out of her car in handcuffs, ignoring her protests, and mocking her credentials. The Black Widow, they had sneered, a nickname they tossed around for women they deemed trouble. Now, she was standing above them, holding their fates in her hands. "Officers Daniels and Miller," she began, her voice slicing through the tension. "It seems today, you're seated on the opposite side of justice." The shock on their faces was unmissable, and the courtroom buzzed with disbelief. Before Judge Roberts could utter another word, Daniels blurted out, "Wait, what is this? How can you be?" She raised her gavel sharply, commanding silence. "You will address me as Your Honor." The gavel struck with a crack, and the chapter on their lives changed forever. 2 days earlier, Alexandria Roberts had been driving home after a long day in her chambers. She loved the city but detested the late-night traffic. Her favorite blues playlist was on, the smooth rhythm helping her unwind. A sudden flash of red and blue lights pierced her rearview mirror, and her chest tightened. She knew the drill. Slowly, she pulled over and turned off the ignition. Keeping her hands visible, she waited as 2 officers approached. "Step out of the vehicle," one barked before she could even ask what the problem was. Alexandria's pulse quickened. "Officers, may I ask why I'm being pulled over?" "Don't talk back. Get out of the car." The second officer yanked her door open without waiting for compliance. She felt a chill run through her. "I'm Judge Alexandria Roberts. I believe you're making a mistake." "Yeah, sure you are," the first one sneered. "And I'm the President of the United States. Hands where I can see them." They dragged her out roughly, ignoring her protests. Passers-by slowed, some recording on their phones, but no one intervened. The officers accused her of driving a stolen vehicle, despite the registration papers being in her name. They cuffed her, shoved her into the back seat of the cruiser, and laughed about her delusions of grandeur all the way to the station. When they got there, she calmly repeated her name and title to every officer she encountered, but none took her seriously. They booked her, photographed her, and locked her in a holding cell overnight. By morning, she was released after another officer recognized her. The department scrambled to issue an apology, but she had already decided how to handle the situation. "Your Honor, we didn't know," Officer Daniels stammered in the courtroom. "You thought my skin color justified your actions," Alexandria interrupted coldly. "You saw a black woman in a nice car and made your assumptions. Is that how you enforce the law?" The officer squirmed, but before they could respond, she added, "You'll have your chance to explain. For now, you'll remain silent." She had spent her life navigating a world that doubted her competence, questioned her achievements, and dismissed her value. And now, here she stood, confronting 2 of its many faces. As the courtroom hung on her every word, Alexandria glanced at the prosecutor, signaling it was time to proceed. Earlier that morning, Alexandria had woken up determined. The last few days had been a whirlwind of meetings with her legal team, assessing every angle of the case against the officers. She wasn't interested in revenge but in accountability, a concept she had devoted her career to upholding. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from her clerk. "Good luck today, Your Honor. They'll have to answer for what they've done." She had smiled faintly, but her resolve was firm. "Justice doesn't care about luck," she muttered to herself. The courtroom was packed with reporters and members of the community who had heard whispers of the case. The news had spread like wildfire. 2 officers accused of racial profiling and misconduct, facing the judge they had wronged. As Alexandria prepared to deliver her opening remarks, she felt the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been mistreated, dismissed, or silenced because of prejudice. The hearing had just begun when a sudden commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. A man burst in, shouting something incomprehensible, his face red with anger. Security rushed to restrain him, but not before his words echoed loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You think you can get away with this, Black Widow? You'll regret this." Gasps filled the room, and Alexandria's eyes narrowed. This was far from over. The man's outburst hung in the air like a storm cloud, his venomous words leaving the courtroom stunned. Security officers wrestled him out of the room as Alexandria sat stone-faced, gripping her gavel tightly. The murmur of voices grew louder, uncertainty rippling through the room. She stood firm, her voice sharp as she spoke. "This court will not be intimidated," she declared. "Proceedings will continue without disruption." The calm authority in her tone silenced the room. But inside, her mind raced. Who was the man? Why had he called her that same nickname the officers had used? Was it a coincidence, or something far more sinister? The prosecutor cleared his throat, drawing the court's attention back. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to begin with evidence of the officer's misconduct." Alexandria gave a curt nod, signaling him to proceed. As the prosecutor detailed the officer's actions, showing dashcam footage and witness statements, Alexandria kept her expression neutral, though her emotions simmered beneath the surface. The video of her arrest played on the screen. Every degrading comment and act of force replayed for all to see. The courtroom was silent except for the audio of the officers mocking her credentials. "Look at her," one officer said on the recording. "She thinks she's better than us because she has a fancy car. Bet she's just a scammer." The other officer laughed. "Probably some kind of drug dealer." "Black Widow? Huh? We'll take care of her." The footage ended, leaving the room tense with disbelief. Alexandria turned her gaze toward the officers. Daniels had his head down, while Miller shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "You both had a lot to say when you thought no one was listening," she said, her voice sharp. "Do you have anything to say for yourselves now?" Daniels stammered, "Your Honor, we didn't mean it like that." "Didn't mean it?" she interrupted. "Every word of that recording suggests otherwise." Before the officers could respond, a loud bang echoed from outside the courtroom. Everyone froze. Another bang followed, this one louder. Alexandria signaled the bailiff, who quickly left to investigate. 3 hours earlier, Alexandria's clerk, Mary, had been rushing through the morning's preparations. The hearing was high-profile, and everything needed to be perfect. She hadn't noticed the man lingering near the courthouse entrance until he spoke. "Excuse me, miss. Is Judge Roberts presiding over the officer misconduct case today?" Mary turned, startled by the man's abruptness. He was tall, with a thick build and a face flushed red, his expression unreadable. She hesitated before answering. "Yes, she is," she said cautiously. "May I help you?" The man smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No, that's all I needed to know." He walked away before Mary could question him further, disappearing into the crowd. Now, sitting in the courtroom, Mary couldn't shake the memory of their interaction. The man's outburst moments ago made her stomach churn. She glanced at Alexandria, whose composure hadn't faltered once despite the tension. The bailiff returned moments later, his face pale. He approached Alexandria and whispered something in her ear. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she straightened in her seat. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're taking a brief recess," she announced. "This court will reconvene in 15 minutes. Officers, remain seated." The audience filed out slowly, murmuring amongst themselves, while Alexandria and the attorneys stepped into chambers. "What's going on?" she asked the bailiff. "Your Honor, there was a suspicious package found outside the courthouse," he said, his voice low. "Bomb squad's on their way." Alexandria's heart sank, but she refused to show fear. "Do we have any leads?" The bailiff hesitated. "The man who interrupted earlier, we think he might be connected." Her mind raced. Was this about the case? Or was she being targeted for reasons beyond the courtroom? 15 minutes later, the courtroom reconvened. but the atmosphere was heavy with unease. Alexandria resumed her place, determined to maintain control despite the chaos outside. "Before we proceed," she said, "I want to make it clear that this court will not be swayed by fear or threats. Justice will be served." Her words steadied the room, and the hearing resumed. The prosecutor called the first witness, a young woman who had filmed the officers during Alexandria's arrest. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," the witness said, her voice trembling slightly. "They treated her like she wasn't even a person. I recorded because I thought someone needed to see what was happening." The prosecutor asked her to describe what she had heard. The witness recounted the officer's slurs and mocking tone, her testimony painting a grim picture of the night in question. As the witness stepped down, Alexandria noticed Miller whispering to his lawyer, his face growing pale. She leaned forward. "Officer Miller, is there something you'd like to share?" He hesitated, glancing nervously at Daniels, who shot him a warning look. "Your Honor," Miller said finally, his voice shaking. I need to tell the truth." The courtroom gasped, and Alexandria's sharp gaze locked on him. "Then tell it," she said, her voice steady. Miller took a deep breath. "We were ordered to stop her," he said, his words tumbling out quickly. "We didn't pull her over randomly. Someone told us to do it." Daniel's head snapped toward him, his face red with anger. "What are you doing?" he hissed. Alexandria's pulse quickened. "Who gave you the order?" Miller swallowed hard. "It was someone higher up, someone in the department." The courtroom erupted into chaos, the revelation sending shockwaves through everyone present. Alexandria banged her gavel, struggling to maintain order. "Enough!" she shouted. "Officer Miller, you will name the individual who gave you this order." Before he could answer, the bailiff rushed in again, his face pale. "Your Honor," he said breathlessly, "we have to evacuate the building." The bomb squad found a live device. The room froze, and Alexandria's heart sank as the reality of the situation set in. This was far from over. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. A live device. The courtroom erupted into panic, the crowd surging toward the exits, ignoring Alexandria's repeated strikes of the gavel. "Order! Order in this court!" she bellowed, her voice cutting through the noise. It was no use. People were scrambling to escape, their fear overwhelming any sense of decorum. Alexandria stood and motioned for the bailiff. "Get everyone out safely," she commanded. "Start with the witnesses and spectators." The bailiff nodded and began directing people toward the exits. Alexandria turned to the officers seated at the defense table. "Daniels, Miller, you'll remain here until we're cleared to leave," she said firmly. "This is still a court of law." Daniels opened his mouth to protest, but Alexandria silenced him with a glare that left no room for argument. Miller, pale and visibly trembling, leaned closer to his attorney. "We've got to get out of here," he whispered. "Not until you finish what you started," Alexandria interjected, her sharp eyes locking onto him. "You made a statement under oath, Officer Miller. I suggest you finish it." The attorney glanced nervously at the judge. "Your Honor, given the circumstances, Your client has an obligation to tell the truth," she interrupted. "A bomb threat doesn't absolve him of that duty." Miller hesitated, his eyes darting toward Daniels, whose glare could have burned through steel. "It was Deputy Chief Garner," Miller finally muttered, his voice barely audible. "He told us to stop her, said she was a problem that needed handling." The courtroom, now half emptied, fell silent. Alexandria's heart pounded. Garner? The man who had publicly supported her judicial appointment? The same man who had shared smiles and handshakes during countless community events? What exactly did he say? "Officer Miller," she asked, her voice steady but cold. Miller swallowed hard. "He told us to pull over a black woman driving a black sedan in the area. Said it was sensitive and that we shouldn't ask too many questions. When we saw you, we assumed that I fit the profile." Alexandria finished for him, her words biting. Daniels slammed his hand on the table. "You don't know what you're saying," he shouted at Miller. "You're digging both our graves." Before Alexandria could respond, the bailiff returned, urgency in his expression. "Your Honor, We need to evacuate immediately. The device has been secured, but the building isn't cleared yet. Alexandria nodded and rose. We'll continue this hearing once safety is ensured. Officers, you're coming with me. Bailiff, ensure they're escorted under strict supervision. As they filed out, Alexandria felt the weight of Miller's words pressing down on her. If Garner was involved, this case wasn't just about her arrest. It was about a deeper corruption that could rot the entire department. Outside the courthouse, the scene was chaotic. Emergency vehicles lined the streets, their lights flashing. The bomb squad worked in coordinated precision, carefully transporting the device away from the building. Reporters shouted questions as Alexandria stepped outside, but she ignored them, her focus on the officers flanking her. She spotted Mary near the perimeter, her face pale. "Are you all right?" Alexandria asked, placing a reassuring hand on her clerk's shoulder. Mary nodded shakily. "I'm fine, but, Judge, this is insane. Do you think it's connected to the case?" Alexandria glanced at the officers, their nervous expressions confirming her suspicions. "It's more than a case, Mary. It's a conspiracy." As the courthouse was swept for additional threats, Alexandria and the legal teams were moved to a secure location, a small conference room in a nearby government building. She didn't waste any time. "Officer Miller, you're under oath. Tell us everything you know about Deputy Chief Garner's involvement," she said, her voice sharp. Miller glanced at Daniels, who shook his head vehemently. "Don't do it, Miller. You're making a mistake." "No," Miller said, his voice growing firmer. "I already made one when I followed his orders." He turned back to Alexandria. "Deputy Chief Garner has a system. He targets people he thinks don't belong in certain areas, wealthy neighborhoods, high-end stores, even the courthouse district. He assigns officers to watch those areas and stop anyone who looks out of place." "And by out of place, you mean black," Alexandria said bluntly. Miller nodded, shamefaced. "Yes, ma'am. He calls it cleaning up the city." A wave of disgust washed over Alexandria. She had spent her career fighting for justice, and now she was staring down the face of systemic racism embedded in the very institution sworn to uphold the law. "Why did you follow these orders?" she asked, her voice low but piercing. Miller hesitated. "Because if we didn't, he'd find a way to ruin us. He's got dirt on everyone in the department. No one dares cross him." Daniels finally snapped. "Shut up, Miller. You're throwing us all under the bus for what? To save yourself?" Miller turned to him, his face hardening. "No, Daniels. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. For once." As the hours dragged on, Alexandria couldn't shake the feeling that the threat wasn't over. Garner wasn't the kind of man to sit quietly while his secrets unraveled. If he was willing to use officers to target civilians, what else was he capable of? Her thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of her phone. A text message flashed on the screen. "You don't know who you're messing with, Judge. Back off, or you'll regret it." Her blood ran cold. Someone had her number. This wasn't just about the officers or the courtroom. It was personal. As she looked up, the room seemed to close in around her. This fight was far from over, and the stakes were growing higher by the second. Alexandria stared at the message on her phone, her mind racing. The words were clear: "Back off, or you'll regret it." She glanced around the conference room, her heart pounding. Whoever sent the message knew how to reach her, which meant they were watching. She rose from her chair, her voice steady despite the unease gripping her. "We're done for today. Officer Miller, you'll remain under protective custody until we reconvene tomorrow. Bailiff, ensure security for everyone involved in this case, especially witnesses." The bailiff nodded, but Alexandria could see the worry in his eyes. She wasn't the only one who understood how dangerous this had become. Later that evening, Alexandria sat in her home office, the glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. She had dealt with threats before. Angry defendants, disgruntled plaintiffs, but this felt different. Garner's influence ran deep, and his reach extended into areas she had only begun to uncover. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at her door. Startled, she grabbed the small canister of pepper spray she kept nearby and approached cautiously. "Who is it?" she called out. "It's me, Mary," came the familiar voice of her clerk. I thought you might need some company tonight. Alexandria opened the door, relief washing over her at the sight of her trusted clerk. Mary stepped in, holding a bag of takeout and a determined expression. I figured you probably haven't eaten, Mary said, setting the bag down on the kitchen counter. And I thought you shouldn't be alone. Alexandria smiled faintly. Thank you, Mary. You didn't have to do this. Mary shrugged. I did. This case is bigger than anyone realized. I overheard some officers talking outside the courthouse today. Garner's name has people scared. Alexandria leaned against the counter, her mind turning over Mary's words. Scared people make mistakes, she said finally. And mistakes leave a trail. The next day, Alexandria arrived at the courthouse under heavy security. The building had been cleared overnight, but the atmosphere was tense. Every officer on duty seemed on edge, their eyes scanning for anything suspicious. Inside the courtroom, Miller looked visibly nervous as he took the stand again. Daniels, on the other hand, sat stiffly, his jaw tight with anger. Alexandria wasted no time. Officer Miller, you testified yesterday that Deputy Chief Garner orchestrates targeted stops based on race. Can you elaborate on how these orders are communicated? She asked. Miller nodded hesitantly. It's not written down anywhere, but he uses code words over the radio. He'll say things like, watch for shadows in Sector 4, which means to stop black people in that area. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Alexandria's jaw tightened. And how many officers are complicit in this system? Miller hesitated. Most of them. It's how the department operates. The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Alexandria's chest tightened as she realized the depth of the corruption. This wasn't just about Garner. This was a systemic problem. Officer Daniels, Alexandria said, turning her gaze to him. Would you like to respond to Officer Miller's testimony? Daniels glared at her, his defiance clear. Miller's lying. He's just trying to save himself. Alexandria raised an eyebrow. And yet, he's risking his career and safety to do so. That doesn't strike me as self-serving. Before Daniels could respond, the doors to the courtroom burst open. A woman in a sharp suit strode in, flanked by two officers in plain clothes. The room turned to watch as she approached the bench. Your Honor, I'm Special Agent Vanessa Caldwell with the FBI, the woman announced, flashing her badge. We have reason to believe Deputy Chief Garner is orchestrating a larger criminal enterprise within the department. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Agent Caldwell continued. We've been building a case for months, but Officer Miller's testimony has given us the leverage we need to act. I'm requesting immediate custody of all evidence related to this case. Alexandria nodded slowly. Agent Caldwell, this court will cooperate fully. However, I must warn you. Garner won't go down without a fight. Caldwell's expression hardened. We're prepared for that, Your Honor. But we need you to stay safe. Garner has a history of silencing threats. Later that evening, Alexandria sat in her chambers, reviewing the day's events. The FBI's involvement brought a new layer of complexity to the case. If Garner's reach extended beyond the local police department, how deep did the corruption go? Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. Another text. You think the FBI can save you? Think again. You're in over your head. She stared at the message, her grip tightening on the phone. This wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. Determined not to be intimidated, she called Agent Caldwell. I need to know everything you have on Garner, she said. And I need it now. As the night wore on, Alexandria found herself unable to sleep. The weight of the case, the threats, and the implications of Garner's operation pressed heavily on her. She poured herself a cup of tea and settled into her favorite armchair, hoping for a moment of clarity. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the quiet. Her heart leaped into her throat as she grabbed her phone and crept toward the sound. The glass door to her patio was shattered, shards glittering on the floor. A brick lay in the middle of the debris, a note tied to it. This is your last warning. She froze, her breath caught in her chest. For the first time, she felt truly unsafe. The fight for justice had just become a fight for survival. Alexandria stood frozen, staring at the shattered glass. Her mind raced with possibilities, every shadow in her dimly lit living room now feeling like a threat. She carefully picked up the brick, untying the note and unfolding it with trembling hands. Your career ends here, or your life does. The choice is yours. She drew a shaky breath, trying to calm the storm of fear rising in her chest. Her training kicked in. Stay calm, assess the situation, and act decisively. She reached for her phone and dialed Agent Caldwell. Agent Caldwell, someone just broke into my home. They left a brick and a note, she said, her voice steady but tight. We're on our way, Caldwell replied without hesitation. Don't touch anything else. Lock yourself in a safe room and wait. Within 20 minutes, Alexandria's home was swarmed by agents and local police. Caldwell herself arrived, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. Are you all right? She asked, placing a reassuring hand on Alexandria's shoulder. I'm fine, Alexandria replied. Shaken but fine. Caldwell picked up the note with gloved hands, her expression hardening as she read it. This is an escalation, she muttered. Garner's trying to send a message, and he's succeeding, Alexandria admitted, her voice low. But I won't let him scare me off. We're too close to exposing the truth. Caldwell nodded. We're assigning a detail to you around the clock. Garner's network is vast, and his people will do whatever it takes to protect him. As Alexandria's home was secured, agents collected evidence, photographing the scene and dusting for fingerprints. Caldwell pulled Alexandria aside. Judge Roberts, I need you to consider relocating temporarily, Caldwell said. Even with protection, your home may not be safe. Alexandria shook her head. This is my home. I won't let him drive me out of it. Caldwell sighed. At least stay in a secure location for the night. We need time to assess the risk. Reluctantly, Alexandria agreed, and she was taken to a safe house under FBI protection. The night passed uneventfully, but the tension in the air was palpable. The next day, the courtroom was eerily quiet. The usual buzz of anticipation was absent, replaced by a somber atmosphere. News of the threats against Alexandria had spread, and the weight of the case was beginning to show. Agent Caldwell sat in the gallery, her presence a silent reminder of the danger surrounding the case. Daniels and Miller were escorted in, both looking more uneasy than ever. Alexandria took her seat, her expression calm but resolute. We will resume where we left off, she announced, her voice steady despite the turmoil of the past 24 hours. Officer Miller, you testified that Deputy Chief Garner operates a system of racial profiling within the department. You also stated that he exerts control through intimidation and blackmail. Can you provide evidence to support these claims? Miller hesitated, glancing at Daniels, who glared at him with barely concealed fury. Finally, Miller spoke. There are emails, he said. Garner uses a private account to communicate instructions. I've seen them. Caldwell's ears perked up, and she scribbled a note to one of her agents. Alexandria leaned forward. Can you provide access to these emails, Officer Miller? I don't have them, he admitted, but I know someone who does. Who? Alexandria asked. Miller hesitated again, clearly weighing his options. Detective Ramos. He's Garner's right-hand man, but he's been keeping a file on everything, just in case. Daniels slammed his fist on the table. You're lying, Miller. Ramos would never betray Garner. Miller's voice hardened. Ramos is scared of Garner, just like everyone else. But he's not stupid. He knows if Garner goes down, anyone tied to him could go down too. That's why he's kept records. The revelation sent ripples through the courtroom. Alexandria nodded, signaling to Caldwell. Agent Caldwell, I believe this warrants immediate investigation. We're already on it, Your Honor, Caldwell replied, standing and exiting the courtroom with her team. Later that evening, Alexandria sat in the safe house, her thoughts racing. Miller's testimony had opened a door, but it was just the beginning. If Ramos had evidence, it could blow the case wide open, or lead to more danger. Her phone buzzed, and she saw a message from Caldwell. We've located Ramos. Meeting him now. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. Moments later, another text came through, this one from an unknown number. Ramos won't talk. You're wasting your time. Alexandria's blood ran cold. Whoever was behind this wasn't just watching her. They were steps ahead. The next morning, Alexandria received a call from Caldwell. Her tone was grim. "We found Ramos, but he's gone." "Gone?" Alexandria asked, her stomach sinking. "Dead," Caldwell said bluntly. "It looks like suicide, but it feels staged." Alexandria closed her eyes, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Garner's operation was more dangerous than she'd imagined, and the stakes had just risen. "We found a laptop at Ramos' apartment," Caldwell continued. "It's encrypted, but we're working on getting access. If there's anything on it, we'll find it." As Alexandria prepared for another day in court, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. Garner wasn't just trying to protect himself. He was willing to destroy anyone in his way. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Daniel sat stone-faced, while Miller looked like he hadn't slept in days. As Alexandria prepared to question Miller further, Caldwell entered the room and approached the bench. "We got into Ramos' laptop," she whispered. "There's evidence, emails, transactions, everything. But there's also a hit list." Alexandria's breath caught. "A hit list?" Caldwell nodded, her expression grim. "Your name is at the top." The courtroom doors burst open, and chaos erupted as a gunshot rang out. Alexandria ducked instinctively as the sound of shouts and screaming filled the room. When she looked up, she saw a figure in the gallery clutching a gun, his eyes wild. The fight for justice had just turned deadly. The courtroom was chaos. People screamed and ducked for cover, scrambling toward the exits as more shots rang out. Alexandria crouched behind the bench, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of what was happening. "Stay down," shouted Agent Caldwell, her voice cutting through the noise. She drew her weapon and motioned for the agents flanking her to close in on the shooter. Alexandria risked a glance over the edge of the bench. The gunman, a disheveled man in his mid-40s, stood in the gallery, his hands shaking as he clutched the weapon. His eyes darted around the room, wild and desperate. "This is all your fault," he shouted, pointing the gun in Alexandria's direction. "You should have stayed out of it." "Drop the weapon," Caldwell ordered, her gun trained on him. "This doesn't have to end like this." For a moment, it looked like the man might comply. He lowered the gun slightly, his hands trembling. Then, suddenly, he raised it again, aiming directly at Alexandria. The world seemed to slow as she braced herself, her breath catching in her throat. A single shot rang out, but it wasn't the gunman's. Caldwell's bullet struck him squarely in the shoulder, and he crumpled to the ground with a howl of pain. Agents swarmed him, disarming and restraining him as the room began to settle. Alexandria exhaled shakily, her pulse still racing. Caldwell approached her, her face tight with concern. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Alexandria said, though her voice wavered. "Who is he?" Caldwell motioned to one of her agents, who handed her the man's ID. She frowned as she read it. "He's a former officer, Robert Hayes, fired from the department 5 years ago for misconduct." "Misconduct?" Alexandria asked, rising slowly. Caldwell nodded. "Excessive force." He was one of Garner's loyalists. The pieces began to click into place. Hayes wasn't just a random attacker. He was sent to send a message. Hours later, Alexandria sat in her chambers, her hands still trembling slightly. The courtroom had been cleared, the day's proceedings postponed. Hayes was in custody, but his attack had shaken everyone involved. Caldwell entered, her expression grim. "We've been interrogating Hayes. He claims he acted alone, but I don't buy it." "Neither do I," Alexandria said. "He's a pawn. Garner's pulling the strings." Caldwell nodded. "The laptop we recovered from Ramos has enough evidence to bring Garner in for questioning. But with what just happened, we have to move fast. Garner won't go down quietly." Alexandria leaned back in her chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "What's our next move?" "We're issuing a warrant for Garner's arrest," Caldwell said. "But we need you to stay under tight security. If Hayes is any indication, Garner's network is willing to go to extremes." That evening, Alexandria returned to the safe house, flanked by agents. She was exhausted, but her mind refused to rest. Every step of this case felt like walking deeper into a minefield. and she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Her phone buzzed with a message from Caldwell. Warrant issued. Garner's being brought in tonight. She sighed with relief, but it was short-lived. Moments later, another message came through. From the same unknown number as before. You think you've won? It's just beginning. Meanwhile, at Garner's suburban home, the FBI surrounded the property. Caldwell stood at the forefront, her weapon drawn. Deputy Chief Garner, this is the FBI. Come out with your hands up. For a moment, there was silence. Then the front door creaked open, and Garner stepped out, his hands raised. He wore a calm expression, but there was a glint of defiance in his eyes. Agent Caldwell, he said smoothly, to what do I owe the pleasure? You know exactly why we're here, Caldwell said. You're under arrest for corruption, misconduct, and conspiracy. We've got the evidence, Garner. Garner chuckled softly as agents moved in to cuff him. Evidence? You think you can take me down with a few emails? You have no idea what you're dealing with. Maybe not, Caldwell replied. But we'll find out. As Garner was led to the waiting vehicle, he glanced over his shoulder. Tell Judge Roberts she's made a powerful enemy. And enemies like me don't forgive or forget. Back at the safe house, Alexandria's phone rang. It was Caldwell. We've got him, she said. Good, Alexandria replied. But this isn't over, is it? Caldwell sighed. No. Garner's been in this game for a long time. He's got allies, resources, and enough dirt to make this a long fight. But this is a start. Alexandria nodded, though a knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. A start is better than nothing. As she ended the call, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a video message. She hesitated, then opened it. The video showed her house, empty, dark, and eerily still. A man's voice, distorted to mask his identity, spoke over the footage. We're always watching, Judge. Sleep well. The screen went black. Alexandria sat frozen, the message playing over and over in her mind. Garner may have been in custody, but his reach was far from severed. The fight for justice was only beginning, and the stakes were higher than ever. The video replayed in Alexandria's mind long after her phone screen went dark. She sat in the dim light of the safe house's living room, every creak of the walls and whistle of the wind outside setting her nerves on edge. Garner was in custody, but his influence still loomed like a shadow. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Agent Caldwell. Alexandria answered, her voice sharper than she intended. Did you know about this? About what? Caldwell asked, alarmed. Alexandria exhaled heavily. I just received a video message. Someone filmed my house, inside and out. The message was clear. They're still watching me. There was a pause on the line. I'll have someone sweep the property again, Caldwell said, and we'll trace the source of the video. Whoever sent it made a mistake. We'll find them. Alexandria wanted to believe her, but the unease gnawing at her wouldn't subside. Caldwell, this isn't just about Garner anymore. He's part of something much bigger. I know, Caldwell replied grimly. And that's why we need to move fast. The next day, Alexandria arrived at the courthouse under even tighter security. Agents flanked her on all sides, their presence a clear warning to anyone planning further intimidation. But the sight of the courtroom only brought back memories of the gunman's attack the day before. She forced herself to push through the fear. Inside, the courtroom was quieter than usual. The gallery was nearly empty except for a few reporters and family members of the officers on trial. The air felt heavy, as though everyone was holding their breath. Bring in the defendants, Alexandria ordered. Daniels and Miller were escorted into the room, their expressions starkly different. Daniels looked defiant, his chin raised as though daring anyone to challenge him. Miller, on the other hand, looked worn down, his shoulders slumped and his eyes darting nervously. Officer Miller, Alexandria began once everyone was seated. Your testimony has revealed serious allegations against Deputy Chief Garner and his operation. Do you have any further information to provide this court? Miller hesitated, glancing at his attorney, who gave a slight nod. Yes, Your Honor, he said finally. There's something I didn't mention before. Alexandria leaned forward, her focus razor-sharp. Go on. Miller swallowed hard. Garner had a list, a rotation of officers he trusted to carry out his orders. Daniels and I were on it, but there were others. I have their names. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Alexandria's expression didn't falter, but her mind raced. Garner's network was even larger than she'd suspected. Provide those names to the court, she instructed. We'll ensure they're investigated thoroughly. Miller nodded, scribbling on a notepad provided by his attorney. When he finished, the bailiff collected the note and handed it to Alexandria. Her stomach sank as she read the list. There were over a dozen names, officers she recognized from her years in the legal system. Some had even testified in her courtroom. Agent Caldwell, Alexandria said, addressing the FBI agent seated in the gallery. This information is now in your hands. I trust you'll act on it immediately. Caldwell nodded, already typing on her phone. The court recessed for the afternoon, and Alexandria retreated to her chambers. She sat at her desk, staring at the list of names Miller had provided. Each one represented a betrayal of the oath these officers had taken to serve and protect. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Caldwell entered, her expression grave. We've started rounding up the officers on the list, she said. But there's something you need to know. What is it? Alexandria asked, her pulse quickening. One of the names on the list, Detective Ramirez, disappeared last night. No one's seen or heard from him since. Alexandria frowned. Do you think he's running? Maybe, Caldwell admitted. But it's also possible he's been silenced. If he knew too much, Garner or someone in his network might have decided he was a liability. The implications were chilling. Alexandria folded her hands on the desk, her expression hardening. What about the others? We've brought in 5 so far, Caldwell said. They're being questioned now. But Judge, this is turning into a race against time. If Garner's allies think we're closing in, they'll start covering their tracks. That night, Alexandria was back at the safe house, but sleep felt impossible. Every creak of the old floorboards made her jump. She sat in the living room, flipping through old case files in an attempt to distract herself. Her phone buzzed, and she hesitated before answering. It was Caldwell again. We've got a problem, she said without preamble. What now? Alexandria asked, her exhaustion clear. 2 of the officers we arrested are dead, Caldwell said. Both killed in custody. Alexandria froze. How is that possible? They were under your protection. Caldwell's voice was grim. We think someone inside the department is feeding information to Garner's network. They're cleaning house, Judge, and they're not stopping at officers. A chill ran down Alexandria's spine. Do you think I'm next? Caldwell didn't respond immediately. We're doing everything we can to keep you safe. But Judge, we need to bring this case to a close before more lives are lost. The next day in court, Alexandria sat at the bench, the weight of recent events pressing heavily on her. The courtroom was tense, the audience smaller than usual, as fear of retaliation kept many at home. Officer Daniels, Alexandria said, her tone sharp. You've been silent throughout these proceedings, but the evidence against you is mounting. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Daniels smirked, his defiance infuriating. I don't have to say anything. This whole trial is a joke. Alexandria's expression didn't waver. You may find this trial amusing, Officer Daniels, but justice is no laughing matter. Before she could continue, the doors to the courtroom burst open. A man in plain clothes rushed in, shouting, Judge Roberts, there's been a breach at the safe house. The room erupted in chaos, and Alexandria felt the blood drain from her face. She knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning of the storm. The words echoed in Alexandria's mind. There's been a breach at the safe house. She froze, gripping the edges of her bench. The courtroom erupted into confusion as whispers and shouts filled the air. Agent Caldwell immediately sprang to her feet, rushing toward the man who had delivered the message. What kind of breach? Caldwell demanded, her voice sharp. The safe house was compromised, the man replied, breathless. Agents stationed there have gone dark, and the place was ransacked. We're trying to assess the damage. Alexandria's heart pounded in her chest. Was anyone hurt? She asked, her voice steady despite the rising panic. We don't know yet, the man said, his face pale. But whoever did this knew what they were looking for. Caldwell turned to Alexandria. "We need to get you out of here. Now." "I'm not leaving," Alexandria said firmly, standing. "Not until I know the full extent of what happened." Caldwell stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Judge, if Garner's network has escalated to this level, they'll come after you next. Staying here is too dangerous." Alexandria met her gaze, her jaw tight. "And if I run now, I send a message that they've won." "That's not happening." Caldwell hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but we're doubling security. No one gets near you without clearance." As the courtroom settled again, Alexandria addressed the room. "We're proceeding with today's hearing. Justice cannot and will not be delayed." She turned to Daniels. "Officer Daniels, as I asked before, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Daniels leaned back in his chair, his smirk fading. "This is a witch hunt," he said coldly. "None of you understand what it's like on the streets. We were following orders to keep the city safe." "Safe for whom?" Alexandria countered. "Your actions didn't make the city safer. They reinforced prejudice and mistrust. You targeted innocent people based on the color of their skin, not the content of their character." Daniels clenched his fists, but before he could respond, Caldwell's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her expression darkened. "Your Honor, we need to talk," she said urgently, motioning for Alexandria to follow her into chambers. Once inside the private chambers, Caldwell handed Alexandria her phone. On the screen was a photo of the safe house, its interior completely destroyed. Furniture was overturned, documents were scattered, and bullet holes marred the walls. But it wasn't the damage that sent a chill through Alexandria. It was the message scrawled in red spray paint across the wall. "Run, judge, or you'll join the list." Alexandria inhaled sharply. "They're making it clear, aren't they?" "They're escalating," Caldwell said. "We're running out of time. Garner may be in custody, but his network is far from broken. They're acting like cornered animals, and that makes them even more dangerous." "What about the agents at the safe house?" Alexandria asked. Caldwell hesitated. "Two injured, one critically. We think the attackers were looking for files related to the case. If they've gotten their hands on any evidence, it could jeopardize everything." Alexandria's fists clenched. "Then we need to act faster." The courtroom reconvened, but the tension in the air was palpable. Alexandria maintained her composure, determined to see the case through despite the growing threats. "Officer Daniels, Officer Miller," she said, addressing the defendants. "This court has heard damning testimony regarding your actions and the systemic corruption within your department. But the truth goes deeper than your arrests or even Deputy Chief Garner's influence. This is about dismantling a system that has allowed injustice to fester for far too long." She turned her gaze to the gallery. "Justice is not just about punishment. It's about accountability, transparency, and rebuilding trust in the institutions meant to protect and serve us all. This case is the beginning of that process." As she spoke, Caldwell's phone buzzed again. This time, her face went pale as she read the message. She leaned toward Alexandria, whispering urgently, "Garner just escaped." Alexandria's breath caught. "How?" "Details are unclear," Caldwell replied. "But we know he had help, likely from someone inside the system. He's gone, Judge, and we have no idea where he is." Later that evening, Alexandria sat in her chambers, trying to process the day's events. Garner's escape had sent shockwaves through the legal and law enforcement communities. News outlets were already running the story, speculating on how a man in custody could vanish so easily. Her phone buzzed again, and she braced herself for another threat. Instead, it was Caldwell. "We have a lead," Caldwell said. "One of the officers we arrested cracked under pressure. They claim Garner's next move is to tie up loose ends." "What kind of loose ends?" Alexandria asked, though she already suspected the answer. "You," Caldwell said bluntly. "Judge Roberts, you're at the top of his list." That night, Alexandria couldn't sleep. She sat by the window of the safe house, now a new location, staring into the darkness. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every sound a warning. Her phone buzzed one final time before midnight. The message was brief but chilling. "I'm closer than you think." The safe house's power suddenly cut out, plunging the room into darkness. Alexandria froze, her pulse racing as she realized the fight had come to her doorstep. The room plunged into an eerie silence as the lights flickered and died, leaving Alexandria in complete darkness. She held her breath, her ears straining for any sound beyond her own rapid heartbeat. She reached for her phone, using its faint glow to navigate through the shadows. "Agent Caldwell," she whispered urgently into her phone. "The power's out at the safe house. I think they're here. We're dispatching a team to you now," Caldwell replied. "Stay low. Lock yourself in a secure room if you can." As she moved toward the reinforced door of the safe room, Alexandria heard the faint creak of footsteps outside. Someone was here. She froze, gripping her phone tightly, then turned off the screen to avoid giving away her location. Her pulse quickened as the sound of breaking glass echoed through the house. They weren't trying to be discreet. They wanted her to know they were coming. Outside, Caldwell's team raced toward the safe house. The lead agent, Ramirez, barked orders into his radio. "We've got a code red. Judge Roberts is under immediate threat. Give you 5 minutes. Make it 3. Caldwell snapped from the passenger seat. She gripped the handle of her firearm, her jaw tight. "We can't lose her." Back inside, Alexandria pressed herself against the wall, her breathing shallow. She could hear the intruders moving closer, their footsteps deliberate and heavy. A deep voice broke the silence. "Judge Roberts," the man called, his tone mockingly polite. "We just want to talk." She clenched her fists, refusing to respond. The sound of a door being kicked open sent a jolt of fear through her, followed by the unmistakable metallic click of a gun being cocked. "Come on, Judge," the voice continued. "You've made a lot of enemies. But we can make all of this go away if you're willing to cooperate." Alexandria's mind raced. They didn't know exactly where she was yet, but it was only a matter of time. She silently edged toward the safe room, praying the noise wouldn't give her away. Outside, the FBI vehicle screeched to a halt, and Caldwell and her team spilled out, weapons drawn. "Secure the perimeter," she ordered. "No one gets in or out." Agents fanned out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they approached the house. Caldwell motioned for Ramirez to follow her to the front door. Inside, Alexandria reached the safe room and quickly typed the code to unlock it. Just as she slipped inside and locked the door behind her, the intruders entered the hallway. "She's here somewhere," one of them muttered. "Check every room." Alexandria pressed her back against the reinforced wall, forcing herself to stay calm. The safe room was soundproof and had its own emergency communication line, but it wouldn't stop them from trying to breach it if they realized she was inside. She reached for the phone mounted on the wall and dialed the emergency line Caldwell had given her. "I'm in the safe room," she whispered. "They're in the house." "Hold tight," Caldwell replied. "We're about to breach." Caldwell motioned for her team to move in. The agents burst through the front door, their weapons drawn. Inside, the intruders froze, caught off guard by the sudden assault. "Drop your weapons," Caldwell shouted. One of the men fired a shot in response, and chaos erupted. Gunfire echoed through the house as the agents exchanged fire with the intruders. Alexandria heard the commotion from the safe room, her heart racing. The battle was brief but intense. Within minutes, the agents had subdued the intruders, pinning them to the ground. Caldwell stormed into the hallway, her weapons still drawn. "Clear the house," she ordered. "Find the judge." An agent located the safe room and called out, "Judge Roberts, it's safe to come out." Alexandria hesitated, then unlocked the door. She stepped out cautiously, her relief tempered by the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "Are you hurt?" Caldwell asked, scanning her for injuries. "No," Alexandria said, her voice steady despite the fear she'd felt moments before. "I'm fine." Caldwell nodded, then turned to the captured intruders. "Who sent you?" she demanded. The man who had spoken earlier smirked, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "You think Garner's the only one pulling strings," he sneered. "You have no idea what you're up against." Caldwell's jaw tightened. "We'll see about that." Later, as the intruders were taken into custody, Alexandria sat in the back of an armored vehicle, her thoughts racing. The attack had shaken her, but it had also strengthened her resolve. Caldwell joined her, sitting across the small space. "We'll relocate you again, somewhere even more secure." Alexandria shook her head. "No more running. If Garner's allies think they can scare me into silence, they're wrong. I'm staying." Caldwell studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but we're taking every precaution. This ends now." That night, Alexandria lay awake in her new location, the events of the evening replaying in her mind. The intruder's words haunted her. "You have no idea what you're up against." Her phone buzzed one final time before dawn. The message was simple but chilling. "Garner's just the beginning." The fight was far from over, but Alexandria was ready. The morning sun streamed through the blinds of Alexandria's new location, but the warmth of its light did little to chase away the unease that lingered from the night before. She sat at the small desk in the corner of the room, reviewing the case notes and evidence. Her resolve was ironclad. This fight would end here, no matter the cost. At the courthouse, security was tighter than ever. The halls buzzed with quiet anticipation, as though everyone knew the trial's conclusion would be more than just another verdict. Alexandria entered the courtroom flanked by agents, her presence commanding attention. This time, the gallery was packed. Reporters, community leaders, and even family members of the officers involved filled the seats. "Bring in the defendants," she instructed. Daniels and Miller were escorted to their seats. Miller's expression was weary, but Daniels wore the same defiant smirk he had since the trial began. Alexandria began. "This court has heard extensive testimony and reviewed overwhelming evidence of systemic corruption within the department. Deputy Chief Garner's escape and the subsequent attacks on this court have only further proven the lengths to which this network will go to evade justice." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Justice cannot and will not be silenced." Agent Caldwell stood in the gallery, her arms crossed, as Alexandria continued. "Officer Daniels, Officer Miller, and all those complicit in these acts have betrayed the public trust. This court hereby finds both defendants guilty of misconduct, conspiracy, and abuse of power." The gavel struck with finality, and the courtroom erupted in murmurs. Daniel's smirk faltered for the first time, replaced by a look of disbelief. Miller lowered his head, a faint expression of relief crossing his face. "Sentencing will be determined at a later date," Alexandria said, standing to leave. "This court is adjourned." As Alexandria exited the courtroom, the crowd outside erupted in cheers. Supporters chanted her name, their voices carrying a palpable sense of hope. But amidst the celebration, she spotted Caldwell waiting for her, her expression serious. "We got a lead on Garner," Caldwell said. "He's hiding out with one of his allies, a high-ranking official in another city." Alexandria nodded. "Go get him." Caldwell hesitated. "Judge, this might be the last move. Garner knows the walls are closing in, and he's desperate. We need to know. Are you prepared for what happens next?" Alexandria met her gaze, her voice unwavering. "I've been prepared since the day this began." That evening, Alexandria returned home. Not the safe house, but her real home, under heavy surveillance. The familiar surroundings brought her a momentary sense of peace. She sat on her couch, staring at the photos of her parents, who had always believed in fighting for justice. Her phone buzzed. A text from Caldwell. "We got him. Garner's in custody. It's over." Alexandria exhaled deeply, the tension she'd carried for weeks finally loosening. It wasn't just about Garner. It was about dismantling the system that had allowed him to thrive. There was still work to do, but this was a victory. In the weeks that followed, arrests were made across the department, and a federal task force was created to address systemic issues. Alexandria became a symbol of resilience and justice, her name etched into the hearts of a community that had long been silenced. Months later, Alexandria stood on the steps of the courthouse, addressing a crowd gathered to celebrate the reforms her case had inspired. She spoke with clarity and strength, her words carrying the weight of a hard-fought battle. "Justice isn't perfect, and it isn't always swift," she said, "but it's worth fighting for. We've taken the first step toward change, and now it's up to all of us to ensure it continues." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the city. For Alexandria, the fight wasn't over, but she stood taller than ever, knowing she had turned the tide. As the crowd chanted her name, she smiled faintly. Justice had found its voice, and it was louder than fear.